Hello everybody, so I will continue on the chapter about international migration, and now we'll cover this last topic on economic effects of immigration. So let's go to slide 81, which we start on this topic here of economic effects of immigration. So immigration raises concerns that the US-born workers might experience negative impacts on their earnings and employment because of competition of immigrants coming to the country. And usually these concerns are raised mainly for those workers with lower levels of education. The main argument is that foreign-born immigrants, or like more recent immigrants, that are in lower levels of education groups, they will tend to compete for jobs with these lower skilled US-born workers, and then they will have negative impacts on the earnings of these workers. And these natives might experience an increasing competition for low-paying jobs with immigrants and also with refugees. And whenever I'm talking using the term here, natives, I'm pretty much saying it's the same as saying US-born workers. So the idea is that immigrants with low levels of education will come to the US and compete for jobs with US-born workers, and this group of people here, they will experience negative impacts on their earnings and maybe also increase in unemployment rates. So that's the question that we have to investigate. Does an increase in labor supply due to immigration have negative effects on labor outcomes of competing lower skilled native workers? On the same thing as saying, does an increase in the proportion of workers in the country, also increase in the proportion of workers in the country, labor supply, an increase in labor supply, exactly due to an increase in immigration, have an effect on the earnings, on employment, or have a negative effect on earnings, negative effect on employment of those low-skilled workers born in the US who are competing for jobs with these immigrants? So that's the question. In this long report funded by the National Academies of Science that I mentioned before in this lecture, the authors, they mentioned that there are no definitive answers because there are numerous and concurrent effects that are related to economic outcomes. And so although there are no definitive answers, what I'm going to try to do here is to provide some of the different results that different economists and researchers did related to the effects of this immigration, or increasing in the labor supply, increasing in the proportion or the number of workers in the country, and how that increase might have affect the earnings and employment rates of those workers born in the US. So there are different results. So for example, immigration reduces the wage and labor supply of competing native workers, and this finding here is based mostly on the work of Jorge Boras. He's an economist based in Harvard, and he mentions that wages of natives decreased by almost 4% when there was a 10% increase in the labor supply of immigrants. So he's pretty much saying that whenever you have an increase in immigration to the country, and usually immigrants with lower skill, they will compete for jobs with US-born workers that are also low skilled in the lower levels of education, and then they will have this negative impact on the US-born workers on their earnings. So an increase in the supply, in the number of immigrants in the country, has negative effect on the wages of US-born workers. On the other hand, other economists show that immigration had a small effect on the wages of native workers with no high school degree between 1990 and 2006. And actually they show that immigration had a small positive effect on average native wages. So actually what they found is that an increase in immigration to the country actually had a positive effect on the earnings of US-born workers. But they also show that immigration had a substantial negative effect on wages of previous immigrants in the long run. So what they are pretty much showing is that immigrants recently arriving to the US, they tend to compete for jobs with other immigrants that entered the country in previous years. So they are highlighting that these immigrants are competing for jobs with other immigrants that arrived to the country in previous years, in previous decades, and they are actually not competing for jobs with US-born workers. So why there are so many different results, in some cases saying that immigration has a negative effect on US-born workers, and in this case he actually saying that immigration has actually a positive effect on the earnings of US-born workers. And David Carr, an economist from UC Berkeley, he mentions that that's the reason that these different studies find getting to different results is that because they have different approaches, different methods in order to analyze the effect of immigration on labor market outcomes. So the first thing that he mentions is that the assumption about immigrants increase the demand for more production in the labor market. The way in which you use this assumption, the way you use this assumption in your methodological approach might make your results be different. So if studies consider that companies will not invest more capital, will not invest more in the production of more goods, of more resources, of more products, then you will find negative effects of immigration labor outcomes. The main argument here in these studies, they're pretty much saying like, oh, we want to analyze the increase in immigration on labor outcomes of US-born workers. So they do not take into account that businesses and companies actually, because there is an increase in immigration, then they will start to increase their production and we will start to hire more people. In this case here, their assumption is that immigration is not going to increase the demand for production in the labor market. But other studies might have a different approach. So if studies consider that companies will actually adjust the production for this increase in demand, then the effect of immigration is approximately zero. So the idea here is that those studies take into account, okay, we have an increase in immigration in the country, but these immigrants will not just compete for jobs, but they will also buy products in the society. They will buy food, they will look for housing, they will spend all different resources that they have in order to buy products to survive. So the companies will tend to produce more exactly because there is an increase in demand for their products. So in that case, they are taking into account that the assumption is that immigration increases the supply of workers, but also increases the demand for products that are produced in the country. So it's pretty much a different methodological approach that will cause the studies to find negative or no effects of immigration on labor market outcomes. Even the way that studies deal with education groups. If studies use 4 education groups, divide people by high school dropouts, high school, some college, and college degree, immigrant dropouts, they lower the relative wages of native dropouts. But if studies take into account only 2 education groups, high school equivalents and college equivalents, they will find that earnings have been largely unaffected by immigration, also tend to zero. So in this case here, their argument is actually in the labor market, what employers look for is people that have a degree that's equivalent to high school or equivalent to college. So what these economists are saying we are just looking at how the labor market is organized, so that's why we divide in the age groups, the education groups in these two categories. And when you divide only in these two categories, you see that an increase in the supply of immigrants does not affect the earnings of native workers. Moreover, immigrants and natives with low levels of education, we can also think about different ways that they compete in the labor market. Some studies might say, oh, they have equal competition. So we assume that they have pretty much equal competition because both of them have lower levels of education. So in this case here, when they take this approach, they will find negative effects of immigration on the wages of US born workers. But if studies consider that natives, that US born workers have advantage over immigrants, then they will find positive effects of immigration on the labor outcomes of US born workers. And what are those advantages? So maybe these US born workers do have lower levels of education as this group, maybe a subgroup of the immigrants entering the country, but they know English, so they have a language proficiency, they have broader social networks because they know more people in the US, they have more family members, they have more friends, they know more people. So these people here, the US born workers with low level of education, they might have disadvantage because lower level of education, but they know English and they have broader social networks than than immigrants with low levels of education. So what David Carr is mentioning is that if different studies, they use different methodological approach, they might find immigration have negative effects on the labor outcomes of native workers, negative in this case, negative here, or no effect, or in some cases, even positive effects on the outcomes of native workers. And just for an overview on the long-term fiscal impact of one immigrant, and this is from this extra paper that I cited at the end of this presentation. Here we have the amount of in US dollars in thousands and pretty much the long-term fiscal impact of one immigrant. And here we are dividing them in not high school graduate, more than high school, and all immigrants combined. And here we have immigrants, so the first generation immigrants, descendants, which is the second generation immigrants, and here the total effect. So what you see is that mostly the more negative fiscal impact you find among immigrants with lower levels of education. So this is kind of supporting that these people, they are using more resources from the country than they are providing to the country. And these negative effects tend to be higher for those with low levels of education and among the first generation immigrants. But as when we look at immigrants with higher levels of education, then you see positive impacts in the first generation, second generation, and that's the overall effect, and which is pretty much adding these two columns here. And the average effect for all immigrants, they are really close to zero here in the case of immigrants, because this positive effect kind of like counterbalances the negative effect, and you have positive effects for second generation immigrants, and then 83 minus 3, you have an average of 80 positive effect of all immigrants on the long-term fiscal impact. And another set of economists also mentioned that natives, they adapt to immigration. Native experience actually occupational upgrading and specialization as an adjustment to increasing immigration flows. While immigrants tend to concentrate on manual jobs due to language and cultural limitations, as we mentioned before, natives, they leave their previous occupations to work on more complex jobs. So maybe in the short term, natives might experience unemployment increases because of increases in immigration, but then they tend to go into more specialized occupation and have an upgrade in their occupation and get more complex jobs, and in the mid and long term they tend to have better earnings. So this pattern generates improvements in native wages and mobility without negative effects on unemployment for unskilled natives. And so just in terms of immigration policies and natives, countries with larger immigrant competition experience a move of native workers to more sophisticated skills with higher incomes, which require higher education levels. Natives engage in entrepreneurial activities in response to larger immigrant competition, and open immigration policies tend to generate better career opportunities for natives when combined with flexible labor markets. So it's pretty much saying, kind of expanding on that previous slide that David Carr summarized, saying that natives, even with those with lower levels of education, when you see an increase in immigration, they will tend to move into other occupations because they know better English, because they have broader social networks, and they go into these jobs that require more sophisticated skills. And in the long term, these natives, they will tend to invest more on their education. So models should take into account skills of workers and capital to assess the effect of immigration on the wages of native workers in the long run. So skill of workers is pretty much saying we have to take into account the education level of workers. Yeah, okay, everybody's taking that into account in the previous models. But not all models are taking into account capital changes, because as you increase the supply of workers in the country, these workers will compete for jobs. There will be an increase in labor supply, but also they will increase the demand for products in the country. So they will also buy food, they will also use transportation, they will also look for housing and so on. So companies, industries will actually want to invest more capital because they will sell those products and make more money to this increase in the number of workers in the country. So the reduced form, the one that just uses skills in their models, does not give a complete information about the wage effect of immigration. These partial estimates are only the effect of direct competition because it's just looking at the supply side. It's not looking at the demand side. And the total wage effect is also determined by indirect complementarities among different types of immigrants and natives. So pretty much saying that the models, like these authors are making the argument that immigration models should not only look at an increased supply of workers in the country due to immigration, but also to an increase in demand that will actually make companies, the private sector, invest more capital, will increase their production, and will actually want to hire more people. So the increase in supply also increases the demand for more products, and then the companies will want to produce more and hire more people. So overall, what these authors they emphasize is that immigration to the US had a modest negative long-run effect on real wages on the least educated natives in between 1990 and 2006. So they actually measure that there is effect on of immigration on the long-term earnings of US-born workers was between minus 2.1% and positive 1.7%. So this range here has 0 in the middle, showing that this result is not statistically significant, saying that actually the increase in immigration did not have significant effect on the earnings of US-born workers. And one historical example that provides us an interesting way to analyze an increasing flow of immigrants to the US is this Mariel Boatlift historical event that happened here in the US in 1980. So for a few months in 1980, 125,000 mostly low-skilled immigrants entered Miami from Mariel Bay, Cuba. In that case, Fidel Castro briefly lifted the Cubans' ban on immigration, and a lot of Cubans came to the US, immigrated to the US. And this is considered a natural experiment because it's pretty much, there is this change in the supply of workers, 125,000 workers entering Miami out of nothing in just these few months in 1980, and that provides what economists call like a shock in the economy because you have an increase in the supply that was not expected, and that's also called a natural experiment. Now we can analyze how labor outcomes were before these few months in 1980 and after these months in 1980 when you had this increase in the supply of low-skilled immigrants in Miami. So just to give you an idea, the workforce of Miami rose by 8% within these few months in 1980. And just to give you an idea of how this is big, the normal immigration to the US increases the nationwide workforce by only about 0.3% per year. So here, in only these few months, it increased the workforce of Miami by 8%, and the national average is 0.3 per year. So the idea is, if immigrants compete with native workers, Miami in the 1980s is exactly where you should see natives having a negative effects on their earnings. So you would see natives' wages drop exactly because of this huge increase in the number of low-skilled immigrants coming this specific city. So David Carr, that I already mentioned before from UC Berkeley, in 1990, he found no difference in wage or employment trends between Miami and other cities that had comparable economy, comparable composition of the population and of the working population. And this was true for workers even at the bottom of the skills ladder. So even for these really low skilled workers, he found no difference in wages of employment trends between Miami and these other cities. The Mariel immigration had essentially no effect on the wages or employment outcomes of non-Cuban workers in the Miami labor market. On the other hand, Jorge Boras, the economist from Harvard, in a book published in 2016 that I cited at the end of this lecture, found that this influx of immigrants in Miami dramatically reduced the wages of native workers. And immigration critics, those people that are against immigration to the US, said, okay, based on this work by Jorge Boras, this debate is settled, so it's pretty much saying that immigration reduced the wages of US-born workers. But the debate is not settled, actually. And what's interesting in this article here that I'm citing at the bottom here, you can go directly to this link. This link here, it's summarizing all these different studies that dealt with the Mariel Boatlift historical process of immigrants entering Miami in 1980. And the economist, Clemens, is the economist that wrote this article in 2017, and he kind of tries to replicate the methodological strategies used by different economists, by David Carr, by Jorge Boras, in order to see why some economists found no negative effects of immigration on native workers, and Jorge Boras found these negative effects. So I will show now here some of these graphs that Clemens show. He includes in this article that's available in this link, and using data from the current population survey. So first, he provides the results of this model here, in which he is looking at how is the trend of the earnings, like in log earnings, of low-skilled wage earnings. So he is pretty much showing here the trend of earnings for workers with high school or less. So he's pretty much saying, okay, the trend of earnings of those workers with really low skill, or those with like high school or less, was already declining before the Mariel Boatlift event. And then in 1980, when you have that process happening, actually what you see is that among this group here, these people start to have a more stable level in their earnings. So their earnings were actually declining before 1980. And with the increase of immigrants coming from Cuba to Miami, actually their earnings, instead of keep dropping as it was in the past, actually stabilized. So actually it was good for their earnings. So there is no sign of a dip in low-skilled Miami wages after the huge arrival of low-skilled Cubans in 1980. And in this specific case here, this subgroup of the population allows an analysis that has 185 observations per year between 1983 and 1987, this period here after the Miami Boatlift event. And here we are using the logarithm of wages because earnings are, it's information that's really skewed. You have a lot of inequality in the labor market, really few people making high earnings and most of the people having low earnings. So you use log wages to analyze it, to kind of like take the strength of outliers of these people making a lot of earnings, and you tend to analyze this in percentage terms when you use the natural logarithm of earnings. But what's important here to highlight is that this group here of workers, US-born workers with low education, high school or less, were experiencing a decline on their average earnings over time before the Mariel Boatlift event. And after that, actually their earnings kind of tend to stay more stable. And this dashed line here is the confidence interval. The confidence interval that shows that this is the point estimate, that's the overall average, but it can be a little higher or lower depending because of issues of the sample size, of the sample design. But you kind of see that even considering here the confidence interval, the dashed lines are not touching this linear trend that we had in the past. So actually, immigrants from Cuba overall make the negative effects on the earnings of the low-skilled US-born workers be better over time. And then Clemens, in this article, he subdivides, he looks at subgroups of only males, only Hispanics, non-Cubans, and only those workers in prime ages, in the ages of 25 to 59, which are the ages that usually have higher earnings. So prime ages, the ages in which people make more earnings. Again, there is no sign of a dip in low-skilled Miami wages for the subgroups of workers. For males only, it was already negative before that event, and of like a lot of Cubans arriving to Miami. And after that, again, the negative effect actually starts being less negative. The same thing for the Hispanic group, not including Cubans, taking out Cubans exactly because we want to know the effect of Cubans on other Hispanics. Again, not really, we had a negative trend, and then you start to have a more stable trend. In this case here, it touches the negative line, the linear trend that we had in the past, but still, you see that before you had a really negative trend and now it's more stable. The same thing for people in prime ages in the labor market. They were already experiencing a negative effect, and then they start to have a more stable earnings over time. Their earnings become more stable. And in this case here, you have a sample size of 89 observations per year, 61 and 142. Whenever you break into these subgroups, you start to lose number of observations, the sample size. And Clemens does again another analysis. Now breaking down for workers with high school only and those with less than high school. Again, no sign of a dip in low-skilled Miami wages, even when we divide workers on high school or less than high school. Those workers with high school only, they were experiencing already a decline on their earnings over time before the Mariel Boatlift, but then after the event, actually their earnings stabilized. And for those with less than high school, okay, it did not got better after the Mariel Boatlift, but what you see is that the overall earnings of these people kept dropping the same way as it was before the Mariel Boatlift event. And if you looked at the confidence interval, the dashed lines here, you see that this linear trend that we saw in the past is within the confidence interval after the Mariel Boatlift event. So you don't see any dip in this negative trend here, because you would expect a dip in the sense that if it was negative, it would be even more negative. But it is not, because the confidence interval is still comprises the same linear trend, the dark dash line, the black dash line in the back here. And then claimants estimate a model that tries to replicate Jorge Boras' model. In this case, Jorge Boras' argues that we should look at the earnings of this really specific group here, males, non-Hispanic, between 25 and 59, with less than high school. Then you finally see, okay, their earnings was already going down. And after the Mariel Boatlift event, then their earnings really dropped a lot. And after a while, start to increase. But then you see here, even considering the confidence interval, the red dashed line, it does not, it's below the black dashed line here, which was the linear trend. So yeah, the Mariel Boatlift, all these low-skilled immigrants from Cuba entering Miami had a negative effect on the earnings of this specific subgroup of the population. But what's the problem here? So we do see a sign of a dip in low-skilled Miami wages for this subgroup, and the dip is exactly this here. It declines below this linear, the historical linear trend that we had before. But Jorge Boras was able to see this negative effect only when he pretty much threw away 91% of the data. Look at this, the sample size. Now we have only 17 observations per year between 1983 and 1987. So the sample size is so small that the results from this are not really reliable, because the sample size is so small that maybe the effects of 1 or 2 or 3 people might be driving these negative effects here. So when people say that because of Jorge Boras' study, this debate is settled, it is not. And in this article here, if you read it, it's really interesting, really easy reading to do, and really going step by step, pointing out these different methodological approaches, and also he gives links to other articles that have been out there in the media. You will see that actually in most of these models, an increase in the supply of immigrants, low-skilled immigrants in the US, do not have a negative effect on the labor outcomes of US-born population. So these are the several references that I use throughout this lecture about international migration. If you cannot read this here, you can download the PDF file from the course website, and so you see here the specific references that I use throughout this lecture. So thank you very much. That's what I had to talk about international migration. Thank you.